Malta?
Well, it's not too bad. It rained a little bit during the night, but it's you can almost swim, you know. So it's it's getting to the end of swimming time.
During the last 2 days, we missed sun.
Yeah, but
Here in Turkey.
it's you know it's very difficult because I think it's highly likely there's going to be a lockdown quite soon here, so people are making the most of it, you know.
Great. So, if you are ready, stage is yours.
Okay, so shall I start? Okay, so thank you very much for having me. I'm going to move at speed, I think, and I want to start from really my world and why, you know, whatever I'm going to be talking about really is based on, I guess, 5 strategic change areas. I mean, I've been a change agent for most of my life before, you know, moving from consultancy into academia and something in between. But I'm very much involved in my country and I guess in Europe. I'm involved in public policy. I'm doing work with the Foreign Affairs Ministry right now. I run a center on which is focusing on connected learning, and it's a joint venture between government here and the Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver. I teach new media at the University of Malta. I have a lot to do with industry in terms of change and the process of change. And I guess I've got very much interested in the blockchain in education as from 2016 onwards. We might discuss a bit more about that as I go through this presentation. The basis of what I'm going to be talking to you about, really, there are 2 key projects that I'm involved with that dovetail into some of these areas. One is a Horizon 2020 project commissioned by the EU, which was really aiming to look at the impact of, first, the blockchain, really, more than anything else, blockchain, a bit of AI, in terms of transforming the European research area. And it's a standard, or it started out as a standard Horizon project, really looking at, you know, coming up with insights, building a community and a community of experts, and then coming up with standard inputs and outputs. And if you look at the outputs, again, pre-COVID, the idea was that we were going to go full speed ahead with surveys, interviews, roundtable conferences, workshops, you know, people pressing the flesh, I guess, and sharing as many insights as possible on what's happening out there in terms of the impact of the blockchain specifically on the future of education. And the idea was that we would put in the same rooms, you know, both technologists, but people coming from pedagogy, people who are in the front line of education and trying to determine, in terms of these technologies which were starting to be used, you know, determine what the future for education was going to be about, so that the European Commission would then move on with new funding regimes. That's the first project. The second project I'm involved with is really on the other side of the scale. It's one of the largest infrastructure projects happening and commissioned by the EU right now. It's all based around the idea of connecting Europe and the idea of coming up with digital building blocks. And here in the middle, I've marked something called EPSI around the blockchain. This is the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure Project. But what the EU has in mind is to come up with building blocks around fundamental processes from EID to archiving to invoicing to signatures. And the idea of these building blocks is that this will be the basis for a framework, a standard, or a software, a bunch of softwares which will be, you know, delivered as on a SaaS model or any combination thereof. And if you drill into the EPSI project, what you've got is this notion of building blocks for future usability. There are 4 initial pilots, and I'm very much involved in this pilot here called the Diplomas pilot. And underneath it, there are a whole bunch of technologists all spread around Europe developing an infrastructure which will hopefully be used. So drilling down, you've got a project which is costing around about 4 million euros. There are about 20 member hosts at the moment, hosting at least one node, about 300 people contributing. And there are new case studies being added all the time. And especially in 2021, I think this project will become much more mainstream than it has been till now. So the idea again is you've got 4 case studies, some common applications, and some platform components. The infrastructure is the blockchain. So you're looking at the blockchain, data technologies, and the network connectivity based around it. So on one side, we've got a research project. On the other side, you've got an infrastructure project. And basically, there's me. I'm 59 years old, and I've been involved in the business of change for most of my life. What I'm going to do here is I'm really going to be basing my talk on 4 observations on the state of play right now, and 4 suggestions on where emerging edtech can go and should be going. They're very personal opinions. I may well, you may well disagree with some of what I have to say, and I think that's the way, I think we should run this little session. So let me start with my first observation, I think, which is that the digital education model is, in my view, nearly broken. And all of us, look at this maybe fondly or maybe with horror. This is the way we used to do things before, I guess, February this year. But the problem with the model is more than that. The problem with the model really is that we've been levering, and particularly higher education has been levered on a one-size-fits-all model for many years. And in a way, the old Victorian model of education hasn't really changed much. And it's really disconnecting from the increasing needs of our students, our learners, for more personalized learning. And this is particularly the case when you have large universities, large state universities sometimes, like the one there is in my country. And on the other side, you have a bunch of, increasingly digital natives, as we used to call them, who have a different need for a different type of education. And again, those of you who look back fondly on crowded lecture rooms, I don't know what you're doing in Turkey. I mean, in Malta, I'm teaching remotely. I will be teaching at 3 p.m. my time, 4 p.m. my time via Zoom, like I'm doing now. But this used to be the problem, though, that we'd be faced with students with shields almost in front of us. And we had to somehow get over these shields to try and get them to experience a real live classroom experience, a lecture hall experience that we all keep on being very fond of, I guess. And on the other side of the scale, especially if you go across the Atlantic and start looking at the models, the business models of education, the idea of private universities, especially in the United States, this is old news now that many high school students in the US say, is it really worth my while to invest a lot of money in college? Because I'm not quite sure that getting myself into debt, into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, is worthwhile. Now, in Europe, we may say this has nothing to do with us, because some of us have free universities. We do in my country. We certainly don't in where my son is supposed to be at the moment. My son, who's 18, is meant to be at Oxford at the moment. He's not at the moment. He's studying virtually online in his bedroom across the courtyard of my house right now. And the other thing you have is when you're talking about some of these universities, on the other side, you also have these concepts of elite colleges telling low-income students that they don't necessarily belong. And those of us who believe in some concept of social justice can kind of relate to it. No, there are some universities that are meant to be for certain people and others aren't. And the reality is that anybody who's been a parent of a young child, aged, I guess, anything from 10 onwards, knows that what's been happening for many years is that students have had this alternative way of learning, of rushing to YouTube, looking at other tools, looking at MOOCs, Coursera's, edX's of this world, and also getting involved in networks, us, educators, getting involved in networks of people like us and trying to find new ideas as to how to teach and how to make our learning more relevant to the people we are meant to be serving. And then, of course, this happened. And it's this picture from the UK where, essentially COVID-19 has exposed something which is quite troublesome, because the lockdown really has not meant that the universities, say in the UK, have closed their doors. If anything, they've had 2 million young people going around to actually occupy accommodation buildings in UK universities, but essentially to protect the bricks and mortar model, which fuels the university model in the UK. And that's what you've had. I'm sure you've seen quite a lot of these things. People locked up, people blaming the government. And in our case, we decided that my son, who was going to be studying online all the time, it was better for him to spend semester 1 here in Malta. It was safer than actually go to the UK. One of the interesting things is that I was involved in the Digital Education Action Plan, and we were really looking at what is going to happen to education because of COVID. And some of the insights we were starting to get, and this is an EU-wide survey, is that 60% of educators had not used distance and online learning before the crisis. It was a big wake-up call. And 95% of people like us actually believe that COVID-19 marks a point of no return. Could I ask you to mute your mics, please? Because I'm getting quite a bad reverb back on my mic. Okay. And what's happened is that online learning resources and content are deemed to need to be more relevant and interactive and easy to use. 60% of people said, oh, as a result of us actually getting used to teaching online, the various Zooms, I've actually improved my digital skill set. And some people say they want to be able to do more with technology. So here's the disconnect. The second one is that all of these technologies that we dream about, the AIs, the blockchains, virtual realities, in my view, they still have to have an impact on education. And it's not surprising seeing some of those responses to EU-wide surveys. And here specifically, I'm going to focus on the blockchain, which as from 2016-17, really has had a lot of promise in terms of promising decentralization, immutability, it can't be broken, it's interoperable, this whole notion of self-sovereignty and trust, and it's all based in one solution. And if you continue the whole promise of the blockchain, and I have written substantially about the subject, in digital interactions, the promise is that users are enabled to choose which specific pieces of their own information, claims or credentials they can disclose to third parties. And when we talk about claims, the verifiable claims, we're talking about credentials such as diplomas, certificates, education degrees. You can extend it out of the education realm and look at business licenses, the whole notion of citizenship, who authorizes what, who can attest to what. If you drill down a bit more into this, into the whole notion of self-sovereign identity, at face value, we have the technology now which gives people the right to create, own and manage their own identity records in a manner which is private and with zero dependency on a central authority to transmit or verify their records. And this, however, implies two things. One is that when it comes to credentials, even our diplomas or certificates, the true owners of those certificates are the recipients, are the learners. And the second one is that in an ideal situation, we should not be locked into the usual vendors that we have all been locked into for many years. And when the blockchain is used properly as a decentralized verification network, it really offers the ability to unlock this power of the digital records by making them more trustworthy and instantly verifiable anywhere in the world. That was the point of departure around about 2016 and 17. But however, if you use the blockchain improperly, it really is just an unnecessary, cumbersome technical layer. And we are still struggling with this as we go along. Just to give you an idea, I think in terms of the promise of the blockchain for education, I mean, I've marked out in yellow, and this goes back to 2018, The premise then was that transcripts, credentials, badges, student records, identity systems, records management, even the whole notion of a fully automated university where all of the administration is migrated to the blockchain is pretty much what we're thinking about in 2018. If you look at the situation now in 2020, that's really hasn't happened. And just to verify this, as part of our Delphi for All project, we've been running waves of surveys with an expert community that I would encourage you and urge you to join. Is one question we said, which emerging technologies such as AI, AR, virtual reality, gaming, data analytics can support digital learning in a higher education context? The surprise was that a lot of the replies said, well, let's use our VLEs and LMSs properly, yes, and let's look at conference tools, and let's look at some data analytics before we even start to contemplate things like artificial intelligence. And if you look at, other questions like what's going to happen once the pandemic is over, all people are imagining right now is more blended learning, so a mix of what we used to do when maybe we can get back into the lecture hall and some tech. We all think education will be more digitized. There'll be a more multidisciplinary approach. Very little about the brave new world that we were thinking about at the time. And this is not just us. I'm sharing with you a slide here from my colleague, Brian Alexander, from Georgetown University in the US, who's a futurist. And you've got a much more market-driven approach. I don't know how much of this slide you can see. All I'm trying to point out to you is that even though the education context in the US might be very different to us, people are still grappling with this idea of which kind of technology are going to be put to good use. You're still talking about LMSs, you're still talking about MOOCs, maybe a bit of gaming. This whole idea about automation in education, blockchain, ebooks is kind of being parceled to maybe the near future. And the dream of the Internet of Things, everything seems to have been suspended, and not necessarily because of COVID. The third point I want to make is that decentralization, the whole dream of decentralization, is really a threat to governance, central governance. And here we have the concept of power, really. So the blockchain, again, at face value, is a trustless technology which addresses many of the risks of centralization, from central repository systems, from, say, an over-dependence on a registrar, or even one particular supplier of a technology. And the idea is that every user or node would store a complete copy of the database. Every user or node has to approve each entry, and the version with the most copies is the true version. Again, I'm not going to drill into the technology of the blockchain. There's plenty out there in terms of what can the blockchain do. But in reality, what you find is that there is significant resistance as soon as you start talking about the blockchain in education, or the blockchain within public sector organizations. Because A, there is little trust in this trustless technology. People will start talking about security, about privacy, about the scalability required for public digital services, and that there is a greater need for care than there is in other sectors. People talk about hacking and cybersecurity, ironically, when the blockchain is really all about no hacking and mitigating fraud. People will say that technology is not mature. People will say, trust minimizing architectures should not replace interpersonal trusts or prevent its emergence. Some people will say open standards have yet to be adopted, and some people will say there's nothing open or decentralized, even about some of the very popular blockchain models. And here I'm mentioning the Estonian blockchain model, which is anything but open or decentralized. The fourth point I'm going to make is that when we talk about interoperability, a lot of people think it's a technology issue. In practice, it really isn't. I'm sharing with you here a slide that I used to share quite a while ago. I was the architect of the nation-state block search projects in my country. And I was to share this simply as an example of how many people I had to get involved with to get digital education certificates notarized on the blockchain in my country for learners from the age of 15 upwards. Interoperability, I repeat, is not a technical issue. You really need to drill down into human networks. And like most things in life, human networks cannot be automated. The same issue is being faced by the EPSI project right now. We can build the most amazing technology on the planet. To get people to use it requires something totally different. So here are some suggestions. They're not prescriptive. They're simply based on my experience. You may choose to disagree with them. My first suggestion is that if you want to do something with emerging technologies, you should really focus on the disconnects, the things which are not working, to determine where, emerging tech might add value to education. One of the many quotes related to the blockchain is that the blockchain is always looking for a nail to hit. Well, I still happen to believe that the nail to hit is education. And again, sharing some insights from our Dell for All project. And by the way, things changed dramatically for this project because once COVID happened, it became a case of don't just look at the blockchain because that might be very 2018. Look at AI, look at AR, look at Internet of Things. And by the way, we need solutions now. And what I'm sharing with you in this crowded slide really is that, some of the main challenges remain basics, incompatible teaching materials, non-existing infrastructure. We don't have the skill sets within teachers. People do see the opportunity, but they're really seeing the opportunity in the various OERs, maybe some learning analytics. And when it comes to priorities, it goes back to give us some more money. Let's start to play around with these new technologies, but how about rethinking the teaching business model before we can move forward? My suggestion, however, is that if we start looking at some of these things in isolation and these disconnects, and then start to look at some of these emerging technologies as to what can they solve, we might be onto something. Specifically, the blockchain was conceived as machines working together to reach consensus, to reach agreement. It really is an appropriate metaphor for collaborative networks. And by building upon the scaffolding of existing trust and relationships, blockchains can spur thinking about data use, about data ownership, and data control. Those three things are never far away from the business of education. I will go one step further. We should consider the blockchain as a decentralized, resilient model for the education system we need, but we do not necessarily have. And again, decentralized and resilient. The second suggestion I have is that if you want to do something drastic, it's always better, or experimental, by the way, it's always better to talk about pilots, to talk about sandboxes, and that's the way you can overcome resistance to change. It's what I did in this country. So when we said we want to try out the blockchain within the context of education, we just called it a pilot, not to scare people. And pilots actually lead on to other pilots. So in the same way that this tiny country became the first nation state to deploy blockchain in education, the government of the Bahamas had sent its whole, senior management over here to see what we were doing. And when they implemented their own blockchain system, they went much further ahead than the Maltese did and didn't just limit the project, the Bloxers project, to education, but started looking at more wider identity systems. At the end of the day, we're talking about identity. An education credential can relate to your education records, but can also relate to your death, birth certificates, registration of housing. There are many other applications in normal life which would benefit from something like this. Again, one of the suggestions would be also to use a carrot and stick approach. And this is one of the things we're looking at Europe, even within the EPSI project. That yes, you do have to look at regulatory frameworks. Yes, you do have to look at technical standards. You need to see what the law says. but strengthening cooperation and exchange with international partners. Telling people this has worked in Malta, so surely it could work in a university in Turkey. Starting the notion of these digital education hubs, the EU is extremely keen on this right now, and linking national and regional digital education initiatives and actors, people with a track record or people who want to get something done. You know, the carrot and stick approach is saying, we're going to get it done. You may need to join this system if you want to get future funding, for instance. Okay, but the idea of cross-sector collaboration and new models for exchange, this is the way we're trying to drive this EPSI project in Europe. My third suggestion to you, and I'm very fond of lifelong learning. I'm the product of a lifelong learning system. I'm somebody who at the age of 18 found that my university in Malta hardly didn't exist. And my first career move was I became an accountant, a trainee accountant. I used to work by day, studied by night, used that credential to escape, and I went into the PhD very late in my life for fun. This, I think, the whole notion that we do not just study and for a very limited period of time at university and expect the job to be waiting for us. Once we start thinking lifelong learning, the idea of credentials that we collect throughout our lifetime and that these credentials belong to us, not necessarily the institution issuing this might help to build, breaking down some of these institutional ideological silos that people might find when trying to change things using emerging tech. One of the things we have to realize is that the credential is never going to go away. In other words, the idea of a verifiable, tamper-proof attestation of our learning is going to remain there pre or post-COVID. I would suggest that the credential itself is going to change. In other words, the fact that my son might have, got a badge for rock climbing or teaching English to foreign students might be as useful to him as the degree he might get at Oxford one day. And if you focus on what the labor market is saying, these kind of ideas crystallize even quicker, I guess, because the labor market has always been on about, you need to have new skills, and that they are looking at other training partners and professional training partners when it comes to training, and that this needs to be combined with the more formal education pathways that people like us who are in higher education are deemed to be serving. And at the same time, there is a new requirement for a new type of credential with the same validity as formal education credentials. This idea of stackable credentials, even micro-credentials, or to be able to actually have work-based experiences also validated and stored somewhere at a par. This is extremely important. At the same time, all credentials are sparring with this idea of transparency and fraud reduction. So lifelong learning and the labor market might be more receptive to the idea of self-sovereign identity, AI, or even blockchain credentials than universities. I can let you know that virtually every single education institution has joined the BlockCerts project in Malta, with one exception, the University of Malta. Someday I will tell you why. My fourth point, and my last point, and this might be a bit off-kilter. I think it helps all of us, those of us who are interested in technology, to dive in a bit deeper and really invest not just in our ICT skills, but in our digital and media literacies. I will specify what I mean by basic digital literacies. In a world where it's very difficult to understand what is truth and what isn't truth, what works and what doesn't work, increasing our 21st century skills on how we can pay attention and focus on what is real and what isn't when we are faced by the attention economy, how we can actually participate in groups, how we can collaborate, how we can actually assess critically as to what is truthful and what isn't truthful, and also focusing on networks, how the networks work, how they don't work, the idea that COVID has, in a way, reiterated the fact that we are all now networked individualists. We're all stuck at home, trying to connect with other people, in my case, in a couple of hours with students who are huddled alone sometimes in rooms, and yet I still have to go into the business of education like I used to. And at the same time, I'm thinking, what I'm doing now, when I'm teaching 50, 60 students, when I compare it to what I used to do before, teaching 50, 60 students, and I could see their faces, is there anything I can do right now, using Zoom and breakout rooms and Flinger and whatever other tools I'm trying to introduce in my teaching, that can in any way help their learning? Digital literacy is a fundamental need in the family, in the boardroom, and in the classroom. So I will finish with this. I think digital disruption can really sometimes be found in the most innocent and the most mundane of applications. It doesn't need to be rocket science, though I will continue to have much hope, I guess, for the blockchain and what the blockchain can do to the education system. This is my last slide. The alternative, what is deemed to be alternative, is not necessarily inferior to what we had or what we used to have. My belief is that the alternative is increasingly likely to become mainstream once COVID-19 is a memory for us. So I think I managed to finish exactly on time. I think it's about 30 minutes. If anybody wants to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn. I teach at university. I run the Commonwealth Centre for Connected Learning. We're always looking for partners. I will stop sharing. And I hope some of that made sense to you. I couldn't see what was happening in the chat box, I'm afraid. But I really wish that sometime we can actually do this, ironically, in person, face to face, over a cup of tea or a glass of wine. So with that, that's what I had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. It was a very nice presentation.
And I assume we're done, really, aren't I? I can go and prepare for my lecture, which starts shortly.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much. Take care of yourselves, all of you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hope to see you in next
We will
future.
somewhere. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye. Evet, değerli katılımcılar. Şimdi bir sonraki panel oturumuna geçiş yapıyor olacağız. Katılımınız için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Görüşmek üzere.